welcome. Today we're having a joint meeting of 350 Contra Costa and the Sunflower Alliance. Just going to give it another minute here to let more people drop into the Zoom room. And we really appreciate you taking a few hours of this beautiful day to learn. I know there's a lot of competing interests with the Super Bowl this afternoon, but we think this is a super important topic, more super than the Super Bowl, and certainly more life-changing and impactful for the people who live near airports and also for the users of airports. So today we are going to talk about the climate impacts of air travel and the expansion of the Oakland Airport. And I'm here from 350 Contra Costa. I'm Jackie Garcia-Mann. And we also have Jean Tepperman from Sunflower Alliance, and she's going to welcome you too and introduce the organizer of this event, who is Ariella Granite. And she will introduce our guests. I think it's going to be a super interesting program today. And let's go. I'm going to turn it to Jean.
Hi, I just wanted to say greetings. We're from Sunflower Alliance. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this with 350 Contra Costa. As a fossil fuel resistance organization, we feel like we have several levels of connection to this issue. Like 350 Contra Costa, we've been interested in the refineries' ideas about converting to biofuel. And biofuel is part of the whole issue with the airport expansion. And also, as we've been focusing on the effects of the fossil fuel industry on frontline communities and the impact of the airport expansion on the neighbors in East Oakland who are already very impacted by various kinds of air pollution. So we're really excited about this meeting, and we're especially excited about connecting with Ariella Granite, who is the driving force in the Stop Oakland Airport Coalition, and brought this to a lot of our attention. And she is going to take it from here and lead the meeting.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Jackie. Thank you, Sunflower Alliance and 350 Contra Costa for everything you're doing. I'm going to start with a 1 or 2 minute overview of the Stop Oakland Airport Expansion Coalition campaign, where we're at now. And then I'll introduce our two speakers today. We'll have short presentations from both of them, and then we'll have a half hour for questions and answers. So save all your questions and answers for that period. I'm going to share my screen with a couple of slides of overview. Well, I think you're seeing my desktop. That's my daughter flying through the sky. And just as a note, that's the only kind of flying my family's doing right now because of the climate emergency. Now, can you see my slide deck?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm one of the lead organizers for the Stop Oak expansion campaign. I'm definitely not the only one. There's a lot of help I'm getting from other folks. And the Port of Oakland's plans to expand the airport came to my attention last May through this newspaper article from the San Jose Mercury News. Oakland Airport eyes huge expansion, new terminal, new gates. And the quote from the airport official was that the Oakland International Airport has begun the public process for examining the possibility of adding a new terminal at Oakland International Airport to build capacity for future demand. So just as a note, this plan includes adding 17 gates. There are currently 29, so that would be like a 58% increase in passenger capacity. There's no plans to expand to add runways. There's no room because the airport is sort of limited by the land it takes up right next to the bay. So this is just to add passenger gates. And so hearing this news, myself and my co-campaign collaborators, we thought, this isn't the time to be increasing capacity for more flying. We have a climate emergency. We need to be flying less. So resonating with that idea, I'm very inspired by the climate scientist Peter Kalmus. I just want to read to you this string on Twitter that he wrote last fall. Let's talk about how to tell when society is shifting out of attempting to continue business as usual and into climate emergency mode. The most important litmus test when politicians start standing up to the fossil fuel industry. As a baseline, we haven't even ended fossil fuel subsidies yet. Politicians are still allowing your taxpayer dollars to subsidize and expand the most deadly industry on the planet. Another litmus test will be when frequent flyer programs are banned. We need policies and programs that discourage overconsumption of fossil fuels, not programs that encourage overconsumption of fossil fuels. That's not climate emergency mode. This next one will be hard for a lot of people to hear, but frankly, so long as commercial aviation continues to grow exponentially, we are not in climate emergency mode as a society. The aviation industry is a litmus test for climate emergency mode. While we do need to travel, I'd count that as a need, yes, we don't need to fly in planes to do so. I'd count that as a convenience or privilege. Yes, society would need to shift norms for this. That's the point. So I find this really applicable to the Oakland Airport plans. And we've come together as a coalition. We now have 45 grassroots organizations, all sharing concerns over the risks of airport expansion, including climate, as Peter Kalmus addressed, and other factors. We've got air pollution is a huge concern for frontline airport neighbors and frontline community at refineries that are refining the jet fuel that is directly transported through a pipeline to the Oakland Airport from Richmond and other refineries. Noise is a concern, sea level rise. The airport is currently, the runways are currently below sea level during high tide events, and there's a pumping system to keep the runways dry. Hazardous materials are stored at the airport. We've got wildfires all year round in the state of California now. Climate change is exacerbating that. Touching on fossil fuel industry again, we shouldn't be investing more money into this business as usual. Labor rights is a concern, and the inequities of flying is a big concern. This campaign is not just about stopping the expansion, it's also about envisioning a better way to do things and a safe and healthy future. So we'd like to promote rail as an alternative to flying. We've seen in the last couple of years that we're all doing remote conferencing like this meeting now. I think business travel has taken a big hit during the pandemic, and business executives don't plan on traveling as much as they used to by airplane. We can do a lot remotely. Focusing on people, not profits. And finally, that we need a just transition away from fossil fuels. And this means restructuring the economy to greener solutions. As I mentioned before, we do have a lot of supportive organizations on board. And I'm really pleased to say that through the shared concern for the Oakland Airport expansion, all these organizations are coming from different angles. We've got climate and environmental justice groups, we've got labor groups, we've got rail groups, and religious groups. And so we hope to keep expanding this network and growing our capacity so that we can have a good, effective public response to the public process. The Oakland International Airport, there is a website, oaklandairport.com, terminal development. The link is at the bottom of this page, laying out the process that they're going through with CEQA and NEPA. CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act, We're right here, sort of in the middle. They've been preparing the draft EIR. We expect it to come out in the fall of this year, and there will be I think a 30-day comment period or 45-day comment period. So we've been spreading awareness about this this topic, and hope to have built a lot of capacity by next fall so that we can have a really robust response, sharing our concerns with this expansion plan. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. The first speaker is Dan Rutherford. He is the Aviation Director at the International Council on Clean Transportation. He's advised international, national, and local governments on emissions control policies for aircraft for almost 15 years. He'll speak about ICCT's research on airline and airport emissions and linkages between fuel efficiency, travel growth, and airport capacity. And I'm hoping that he'll be able to shine a light on our campaign, our local campaign here, on the emissions from the Oakland Airport and the Bay Area aviation scene and climate impacts in general. Thank you, Dan.
Great, thank you, Ariella, and nice to be here today. Can I just check if everyone can see my screen now?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. I'm very happy to be here today to introduce some of my research on airline and airport emissions. I think this is a really important area, and I'm really excited about sort of this the activities that Ariella just introduced, because I think airports very much are coming up to the forefront of of activism on aviation emissions. I'm just actually getting up to speed on this issue myself. Most of my research to date has focused on airlines and national policies, but I have started to think more about airports and their role in mitigating emissions, and I'm happy to talk you through some of that initial research today. So this is the outline of my presentation. I thought I'd start a little bit with a bit of background about my organization, the ICCT, for those of you who are not familiar with our work. I would like to get on the same page with everyone about this question of why aviation emissions are hard to abate. People tend to be a little more familiar with maybe the technology aspects of this, but there are also some really important economic and also social barriers to reducing emissions that I hope people will think a little bit about as well. I'll then introduce some recent research on airport emissions. In particular, I'd like to introduce one online website that people can use to inform their activism around this issue. I'll talk a little bit about solutions, specifically technologies that can be used to reduce aviation emissions. I will touch upon the role of sustainable aviation fuels and biofuels, since I know that's an area of interest for everyone, and then close with some thoughts about what we can all do. So for those of you who are not familiar with the ICCT, we are a research-based environmental nonprofit that works directly with environmental regulators globally to find best practices to reduce transportation emissions. We work both on air pollution and climate change. We cover all the major modes of transport, so passenger vehicles, heavy-duty trucks and buses, planes, ships, and also the fuels that they use. Personally, I work on both aviation and shipping. So a lot of my work feeds into two UN agencies that regulate international transport. So that's the International Maritime Organization, which is based in London, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is based in Montreal. If you ask people what they like, the one thing they know ICCT for, it's that we were the group that commissioned the first research that uncovered the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. And over time, we've been working the auto industry towards widespread introduction of electric vehicles afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about aviation itself. If you've looked into this issue at all, one figure you hear over and over again is that airlines are responsible for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And you often hear the modifier only 2% of global emissions, because that's how it's generally framed. The important thing to realize is that basically there's no one on the planet for whom aviation is only 2% of their emissions. It's either 0% of your emissions or it's 20% or more of your emissions. And the reason is that the figures are a little bit fuzzy here, but somewhere in the range of 90% of the world's population doesn't fly in a given year. And only about 3% of the world's population are frequent flyers. So when you hear that flying is 2% of emissions, you're taking a pretty large number and you're dividing it by 7.4 billion people, many of who don't currently fly. So this overlap between flying is only 2% of emissions and flying is only 2% of my emissions is in fact very, very small. There's also potential for tremendous growth in this sector. And rather than throw a lot of kind of numbers at you, I thought I'd try to present this in a sort of a concrete thought experiment. So globally, the aviation sector emitted about a gigaton of carbon in 2019, so about 1,000 million tons. Of that, 3/4 was passenger aviation, so about 750 million tons in a given year, about the same size as emissions from the German economy. On average, however, that equals one one-way short-haul flight per person per year, so about 700-kilometer flight one way. Do the thought experiment. Everyone on Earth doesn't take a one-way short-haul flight. They take a round-trip short-haul flight. The result would be about 1.3 gigatons of CO2, or larger than the Japanese economy. If everyone on the planet took one round-trip long-haul flight, the overall CO2 footprint of aviation would be in excess of 9 gigatons in a year. So 60% more than the entire United States and just shy of China. So this drives home not only the inequity of aviation, but also the fact that there's tremendous growth potential from the sector if more people start to fly regularly. So let's talk a little bit about why aviation emissions are hard to abate. You typically hear that there are 3 sectors that are going to go last, that are going to decarbonize later than others. It's aviation, it's shipping, and it's heavy industry. And there are 3 big reasons why aviation is a tough nut to crack. There's the underlying physics in which aircraft are very mass sensitive, and they're reliant upon very energy dense fuels. That's one. That's actually the bread and butter of my work. I'm sort of a technology and policy guy. But after doing this work for about a decade, I began to become quite sensitive of some of the other barriers. And those are the economic barriers. That's a business model that drives towards the least cost fuels, the least cost planes, and the least cost business operations overall. That is an issue. And then there are important cultural issues as well. The reality is that aviation and environment is still very much a Wild West. It's an unregulated space, and it's unregulated in part because the people who make the decisions are extremely reliant upon aviation in their daily lives. So we'll talk about these 3 in some detail. First is physics. Planes operate at high speeds. They operate over long distances. And as a result, they're reliant upon liquid fossil fuels, in essence. The energy density per unit mass for fossil jet fuel is about 50 times that of a battery. So road transport, we can see electrifying pretty rapidly. Planes are not going to electrify for anything above regional flights for the foreseeable future. And this imposes sort of limitations on what technologies can be brought into service. This is one of my favorite aviation and environmental graphics taken from Twitter. A fellow named Kevin Pluck, a Kiwi. He was living in the UK and he flew back to New Zealand about 2 years ago. And he did this calculation of how much oil it took to move him from the UK to New Zealand. And it was 4 barrels in his case. Just shows you how much energy and fossil fuels are involved in long haul travel. Economics, there's a really strong driver towards the least cost ticket. And it cuts across the fuels that are used, the aircraft that are bought, and in particular, how the airlines make low cost tickets available to the consumers. I did some online shopping a couple of days ago, looked at the price of jet fuel, looked at the price of vegetable oil. Jet fuel, which is largely untaxed in most of the world, costs about 1/5 how much a virgin vegetable oil sold in a supermarket would cost. But the airlines themselves are competing to get the lowest cost ticket in front of the eyes of consumers. There's a saying, if you're an airline and your ticket doesn't show up in the first search page of like Kayak or Google Flights, you're dead. Consumers don't go to that second page to find your flight. And accordingly, there's this real conundrum of, we know that technologies to decarbonize aviation are going to be more expensive, but no one has yet figured out how to make the business case and identify who's going to pay for those technologies. The third is more of a social barrier. And I'll provide some concrete figures to you in a second, but the reality is that the people who make decisions about aviation policy are very much embedded in the system and reliant upon cheap and accessible aviation, both professionally and personally. There's this term on Capitol Hill called jet fumes. And what it refers to is the fact that in the Senate, the workday is actually 3 days. So senators spend 3 days in DC and 4 days typically at home. And there's a rush at the end of the workday on Thursday for all the senators to get out of town, get to the airport and get home. And this is called jet fumes. They say jet fume, oh, we're on jet fumes. And that means that work actually gets done because people are trying to get to the airport. This really highlights the fact that aviation is very much embedded in the power structure, especially in Washington, DC, but also, as I can tell you from personal experience, at the United Nations. One thing to know is that there is no such thing as an average flyer. So I'm oversimplifying a little bit here. You can find a couple of people, but the reality is that frequent flyers dominate both the number of tickets purchased and the resulting environmental footprint worldwide. A number of researchers have looked at a lot of countries on this, and they tend to come up with very similar figures. About 15% of a given country's population takes about 70% of the flights. In the United States, the breakdown is 12% of adults, I call them frequent flyers. They fly 6 times or more per year. They take a little more than 2/3 of the trips and have at least 2/3 of the environmental footprint of flying. Half of Americans never fly in a given year. And then about 1/3 of Americans are what I call infrequent flyers. They fly between 1 and 5 times. So when you hear about sort of equity arguments about aviation, like we shouldn't impose a cost, we shouldn't tax aviation because that would be unfair, to poorer communities, for example. Keep this in mind. More than 2/3 of the trips are actually being taken by frequent flyers, and they tend to have, on average, higher incomes. Now, economists that study consumer behavior will say that this type of skew is not unusual. Like a small number of people are responsible for most of the alcohol consumption, most of the tobacco consumption, most of the luxury watch purchases. The difference is we don't put alcoholics in charge of alcohol policy, but flyaholics are in charge of all aviation policy globally. I do want to say that I'm part of the problem. I travel a lot of myself for work, specifically to cover these UN agencies in Montreal and in London. So on a typical year pre-COVID, this work flying was responsible for about 3/4 of my own personal emissions. What's interesting, though, is the intensity of it. I calculated this a couple years back. A day that I am on a plane personally, I am increasing my greenhouse gas footprint by 75-fold compared to a day that I'm at home, which kind of highlights not only that aviation is a significant emissions driver, it's also arguably the one thing that you can do, the one discrete decision you can make that can radically change your environmental footprint in any given day. So that's kind of context on why aviation emissions are hard to abate and why we should be concerned about them. Let's talk about airports themselves, and I think I'm going a little bit long, so apologies. The interesting thing about aviation is the further you drill down to wealthy urban areas, and the larger the per person emissions get. And this is reflects the fact that wealth is a big driver of flying, and that has an environmental footprint. So, sort of high level, I said 2.4% of global CO2 is aviation. You go down to the state level, you go to the level of California, and it's actually 9%. So flying is 9% of California emissions. And this map just sort of shows how passenger emissions are distributed throughout the United States. The pie chart is actually showing the breakdown of aviation CO2 amongst 12 states that are currently suing US EPA over a failure to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. That's California, 11 other states, in Washington, DC. That's about half of the pie. And then the remaining half are the other 38 states. If you drill down to the level of the Bay Area, the share gets even larger. The second row to the bottom here is our estimation of the passenger aviation CO2 from San Francisco Airport, Oakland Airport, and San Jose Airport relative to the overall Bay Area inventory. And here we're up to 11% now. Again, we're getting smaller scale, we're getting to smaller, richer areas, and the relative importance of aviation goes up. Couple of additional thoughts on airline emissions. For the first 5 years or so I was working on aviation, I studied fuel efficiency exclusively. So doing technology assessments for aircraft and aircraft engines, also helping design the first fuel efficiency standard for aircraft as part of this, this UN process. It was only after that I started to look at traffic growth. And this is where things get a little bit grim. The reality is, over the past 30 to 40 years, the rate of traffic growth has been traditionally 3 to 4 times faster than the rate of fuel efficiency improvement. And this is what is driving the rapid increase of emissions over time. We released a study several years back where we looked specifically at the US from 2005 to 2019. And we broke down the airlines by sort of classic network carriers like United Airlines and American Airlines versus low-cost carriers like Southwest or Spirit or Frontier. And we compared the increase in traffic, that's RPMs, revenue passenger miles, to fuel efficiency improvements and then the overall fuel use from those operations. And the results were really quite interesting. The network carriers are growing slower. They basically offset their traffic growth with fuel efficiency improvements. And as a result, there was very little increase in the fuel use and emissions from those network carriers. But low-cost carriers are growing so fast that they're currently responsible for 90% of emissions growth in the United States. So this is, again, the Southwest, the Spirits, the Frontiers, Sun Country, et cetera. They're actually more fuel efficient than the network carriers are. They are improving faster than the network carriers, but their traffic growth is about 4 times as fast as their fuel efficiency improvement. And as a result, that's driving most of the growth in emissions and fuel use. So that really highlighted for me that in addition to everything, all of the work that ICCT does on aircraft, on engines, on fuels, we also need to be thinking about traffic growth and what appropriate levels of traffic growth are. This becomes very clear when you look at the distribution of aviation traffic globally. The poorest half of the world, as measured by average income for their country, was only responsible for 10% of aviation emissions. And the high-income countries, which represent about 16% of global population, they're driving more than 60% of the climate problem from aviation. So those of us who are lucky enough to live in wealthier countries, we have a dual obligation here. We have an obligation to help drive the technologies that can decarbonize flight, but we also have an obligation to make sure that traffic growth doesn't outstrip our environmental constraints in order that others who are less fortunate than us can also enjoy mobility. For that reason, I was involved in the development of a website that you can use. The link is airporttracker.org. It's a resource to anyone who is curious about the environmental footprint of their local airport and wants to become engaged in these issues. I'd encourage everyone to use it. We present passenger carbon dioxide emissions for the largest 1,300 airports globally. And that covers about 99% of total emissions. So yeah, it's a good resource. I know Oakland Airport pops up if you put it in there, and you can learn more about the existing footprint of operations there. I want to say a few things about solutions, and then maybe a few thoughts on what we can all do to address this problem. The technologies that we'll need to decarbonize aviation are coming into focus now. It's been a long time coming. In the first almost decade that I worked on this, we didn't see much innovation. We didn't see much fundamental interest in zero emission aviation. That is changing, but it will take time. And it's going to be a combination of getting the best wing and tube aircraft we can, starting to generate sustainable aviation fuels from the best feedstocks. So these would be cellulosic wastes and excess renewable electricity, or called e-fuels. We expect that there will be a shift eventually from these current wing and tube aircraft to advanced designs like blended wing body or double bubble designs, where you can start to the current wing and tube aircraft that we're all used to. They're kind of strange beasts. You've got a wing that generates essentially all of the lift, and then you have the fuselage, which carries the payload. These future advanced concepts start to mix the two. You start to have an aircraft design that can generate a lift off of the fuselage, and in doing so, reduce the fuel consumption of those planes by about 10 to 15%, we hope. Eventually, starting in 2035 or so, there'll be a transition towards zero emission planes. So these are planes that either operate off of hydrogen or, for the shortest flights, electricity, that can get us away from carbon containing fuels completely. I know there's a lot of interest in sustainable aviation fuel, since this is front and center right now. ICCT's views are that, we expect that there will be good sustainable aviation fuels that can significantly reduce the life cycle emissions of aviation, but they won't be cheap and they won't come quickly. We are closely monitoring policy in Europe right now, because the European Commission has proposed a mandate for the use of sustainable aviation fuels. It starts small. It starts at 2% of fuel supply in 2025, but then increases pretty rapidly afterwards. By 2035, the mandate would, if it's accepted, would hit 20% of fuel supply. And that's the point at which we think the sustainable biofuel feedstocks will really be outstripped, and we'll need to make a transition towards synthetic jet fuels that use excess renewable electricity and carbon captured, perhaps from the atmosphere. So, up to 2035, we see waste biofuels and lignocellulosic fuels as part of the mix. Afterwards, it's mostly synthetic fuels. And I think everyone is aware of this. There's a trick with biofuels: is there are good biofuels and there are bad biofuels. The good biofuels with the largest life cycle emission reductions are not the cheapest, and they're not the fuels that are readily available today. The scariest biofuels are those that are produced from crops, which can compete obviously with food production, but have the potential to drive tropical deforestation and actually have higher life cycle emissions than fossil jet fuel. So our advice here is, devil is in the details. Get your life cycle assessment right. Make sure you're using the good feedstocks, and don't push too far too fast. Sorry, I think I'm going very, very long. Just a couple of final thoughts. What can we all do about this issue? Definitely encourage people to continue to study and do research. There's without a doubt a role for organization, for advocacy, for vote, and also for protest. This picture actually is from a protest that I got to walk in. This was September of 2019 in Montreal. This is right in front of the International Civil Aviation Organization's building. Greta Thunberg had come over. You might recall she had come over to New York for the UN General Assembly in a catamaran. She then went up to Montreal, and 500,000 people marched in the streets of Montreal as part of a climate protest. It was a great day. And I think that is really important, because fundamentally, the people who make the aviation decisions when the rest of us are not involved, they are flyaholics, and they quite honestly look out for their own interests along the way. I already mentioned responsible airport growth. I think it is important that, in particular, those of us who already have significant access to aviation don't try to gobble up even a larger share of the pie. And there is a role for both demanding better emissions disclosure and also low impact travel options, which I didn't get a chance to touch on today, but happy to answer questions about later.
Thank you, Dan. How many more slides? We're starting to run into the question and answer time, and this has been so much great content.
This is it. This is my last slide.
Awesome. Go for it.
I'll just leave it there, actually. I can't say it better than Greta did.
Indeed. Okay, everyone, I'm sure you have just as many questions as I have, but save them, write them down. We're going to hear from our next speaker. And then please submit your questions in the chat, and we'll have a question and answer period for both presentations at one time. The next speaker is Casey Coward of the SEIU United Service Workers West. This is the labor union representing thousands of service workers at California's airports, including the Oakland Airport. He will share with us today about the campaign that brings together union and climate activists to resist the LAX Los Angeles airport expansion. This is a very much related campaign to Stop Oak expansion because we share the same environmental justice and climate concerns. And likewise, LAX and Oakland airports are arrival and destination airports for each other. So take it away, Casey. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen all right here? The first slide. All right, great. Yeah, so I'm Casey. I'm a researcher over at SEIU United Service Workers West. We are a labor union that represents about 40,000 members across the state, primarily janitorial and security service workers, but we have a really substantial division of the subcontracted airport passenger service workers at LAX, SFO, and then smaller contingents at a handful of other airports throughout the state. These are all the low-wage jobs at the airport that make things work, that are not direct employees of the airlines. They are subcontracted folks. It's kind of an unseemly industry. But we have several thousand members at LAX, the majority of which live within just a few miles of the airport. So we're pretty substantial stakeholders, both for our members in their work, but also in the community as residents of these sort of airport adjacent neighborhoods. This will be just a kind of a practical overview of a campaign of ours that we led that ran for a couple years, ending earlier this year, related to the expansion of LAX's airport. So I'll just go over what it looked like, what the challenges were, what the essential pieces of our campaign were, and what the similarities are to this Oakland effort. So this particular project was called the Airport and Terminal Modernization Project, ATMP. It's the addition of 2 new terminals and 21 net new gates at LAX, a bunch of updates to the airfield, a bunch of updates to the landside transportation components. They're adding an automated people mover. It's a huge multi-year, multi-billion-dollar project. And the new terminals are going to be occupied by Southwest and United Airlines. The construction is supposed to start this year to be finished in 2028 in time for the Olympics in Los Angeles. That's one of the big reasons this project is happening. It's an enabling project for the city to host the Olympics, which is a whole other question of is this good for the area? We won't get into that. And the environmental review process of this took place from late 2020 to early 2022. I'll talk more about that soon. And part of the, I think, differences between this campaign and the Oakland one right now is this is something we had to kind of make a call on relatively early on after we started moving the coalition and dealing with the politics of it. Our sense of this was that this particular project was largely perceived as entirely inevitable. It was happening with or without anyone's opposition. It is just too important to the electeds in the city, to the legacy, the political legacy of Mayor Garcetti, who's now termed out and has for years now had kind of presidential designs. And so hosting the Olympics smoothly in the city is just, it's too important to all the electeds in Los Angeles. all the business interests in Los Angeles. And this did factor into how we approached this campaign. It did factor into what other groups were telling us about their participation in this. Most of them were simply ignoring it. We were pretty surprised early on how this wasn't a bigger deal. And that was honestly the reason we got back most frequently was this thing is happening. We're not gonna spend our organization's resources fighting it. So we did have to adjust how we approach this campaign. And then the other thing you should know is and it's kind of obvious, is the enormous financial interest of the airlines in having this get done. LAX is one of the, depending on the year, it could be as high as the third largest airport in the entire world. And then even within the United States, it is among the fastest growing of the major airports. It's a bottlenecked airport. They're for the most part out of space to expand in. And all the airlines that are there are competing for market share at this airport. Southwest and United are like 4th and 5th. And it's just really huge to these airlines' business interests to carve out a bigger piece of that, that growing pie over there. And then the other sort of down to earth reality here is deregulation in the industry. This looms over absolutely everything you propose and campaign on in the United States in environmental justice related to this industry, which is you can't regulate the price or route of an airline. It's a tremendous challenge. Almost everything you could think of to talk about, even if you did have the airport's ear on how to reduce impact, almost everything will come back as we can't do that. It's preempted. So that drastically shapes if you are in the business of getting into the how you reduce emissions once the project is approved or is on track. Yeah, you run into this everywhere. It's a big problem. But the outcomes, and then I'll talk about what the campaign looked like. But we were able to primarily transit, environmental, and labor elements were what we got out of the eventual agreement with LAX. The transit pieces were $5 million for an on-demand microtransit shuttle for LAX workers living near the airport. We were trying to do two things. We're trying to get cars off the road, and we're trying to get more affordable and convenient options to commute for our members and for folks that live near the airport. We got them to fund a carpool incentive parking program, which essentially halves the cost of parking fees at the airport for our members if they're part of carpool. The expense of parking is enormous and a critical issue to our members at the airport. Low-wage folks cannot afford the type of charges they are to park at their own place of work. It's a bit of a challenge. This was something we had was not the easiest time to get to because making parking cheaper at the airport is kind of counter to our environmental message and strategies here. So we did have to kind of help educate our members on this and push back a bit. And that's the outcome there. And then we got up to $7 million of funding for subsidized public transit passes for folks. We're pushing for free, but FAA preemption was the given reason. And this is something that the airlines or the airport in our bargaining with them, which took place over several months between November and this February. This is something that came up every single issue we ever tackled. The airport operations and environmental components of our agreement, GSE fleet emissions reduction, ground support equipment. This is one of the few areas where the airport does have a little more leeway to touch on the impact of this industry. We got them to agree to a program that would essentially, it's kind of tricky how you have to configure it, but it would be the equivalent of a 70% all electric fleet of ground support equipment vehicles by 2031, and then the equivalent of totally electric by 2035, with a lot of funding for a GSE incentive program. This is not something they can do by mandate. They have to do incentive programs because of FAA issues. We got them to touch on their electric vehicle purchasing policy for their own fleet. 100% of their light duty vehicle fleet will be electric vehicles that they purchase by 2031. And then for 2034, they'll have a plan in place for the medium and heavy duty, which is much more challenging because the viable electric options, the electric alternatives are not all the way there in those types of vehicles within their fleet. We got them to add targets for 2024 for the zero emission vehicle requirements for vehicles used at LAX, not their own fleet, or vehicles that regularly service LAX. We got them to commit to 15% of their own power needs, and the amount of power an airport uses is unbelievably substantial. We got them to commit to 15% of that being on-site renewables by 2035. This was a very challenging ask. For a long time, their offer was 0%, and it's a thing that gets very complicated very quickly because of the way that the grid works, and because of the way that you can do solar at airports and FAA limitations on that. And then finally, and this is my favorite one, and this was like my pet issue for a long time, was we got them to agree to facilitate a community health and a worksite, a pair of studies, community health and worksite exposure studies. We could not get them to agree to fund it, but I'll talk more about that in a bit because of FAA issues again. And as you can imagine, the enormous resistance to an airport commissioning a study that would demonstrate how much they're poisoning and affecting their adjacent communities. But so there's two studies here, and we were going to get them independently conducted. So likely USC, UCLA scientists. The community health one is going to be a focus on the health impacts of ultrafine particulate matter, which is strongly linked to the activity of this industry on the neighboring communities. And then the worksite exposure studies, this is stuff we've seen, similar ones in Europe, not so much in the United States, on various job classifications, various parts of the airport, what it is the workers are actually being exposed to throughout the day in different jobs at LAX. So we're very excited about that. We ended up getting there's a resolution going through the Los Angeles City Council right now for $3 million in funding for these studies. So that's how we worked around the FAA stuff. We're getting it funded by the city, and then LAX themselves has to cooperate and facilitate with it. And then for us, we're a labor organization, so labor standards were a part of what we got on this and what we pursued. I won't go into it now because this isn't quite the type of audience for it, but the labor conditions for low-wage workers at airports and in these jobs are very poor. It's an industry that's rampant with wage theft and abuse and retaliation and all sorts of stuff. It's pretty awful. We got them to agree to collaborate with the city's Bureau of Contract Administration to better enforce minimum wage laws and labor standards at the airport. We got them to, these will be funded city wage theft investigators at LAX, along with a program that includes annual audits of companies with a history of labor violations at LAX. We have know your rights trainings for LAX workers because you can't just do a top-down approach to this kind of stuff for workers. You have to reach out to them directly to really be effective at it. And then we have, to that end, sort of community-based workers' rights outreach to LAX workers with funding. This is a model we use with a lot of success in our other divisions like janitorial and security. We have security badges at the airport for union representatives and outreach workers. Security badges for union reps is something I can count on one hand, the number of airports in the entire country where that's a reality. So this was actually a bigger win. That was a bigger deal to our folks than I think would make sense to everyone on this call. But and then we got them to commit to investigations and removal of contractors with repeated labor violations. You would be surprised how long the bad actors in this industry can survive at the airport. It's pretty grim how it is for folks. And the airport does not even really acknowledge this almost shadow economy of service workers that keep airports actually functioning, and let alone to the point where they're willing to bounce contractors out of their airport for the kind of business that they do. So yeah, we're overall quite happy with the outcomes given the challenges and the headwinds of this type of campaign and operating in this space. And then because of other factors that I'll talk about now. So essential pieces of this campaign, the legal strategy was really the skeleton of how we were able to drive action on this campaign. They did a CEQA process and a NEPA draft as well. In this, we had some pretty top flight CEQA attorneys that we retained, and we made formal public comments at every possible stage of the CEQA draft and a final EIR. We even did public comments on the SCAG transit planning draft EIR. SCAG is the Southern California Association of Governments. It's a metropolitan area transit planning authority that produces these long region-wide 25-year transit planning documents that are relied on in the EIR for the project at the airport itself in a sort of indirect way. Basically, the EIR will say, oh, well, all the impact on regional flight levels that this enabling project at the airport will have are totally cool because this other group signed off on it. So we had to kind of get to strengthen our case about what we were doing on this project. It made sense to comment on that EIR as well. A lot of this was driven by how we could best preserve our, the most potent case if it came to a legal challenge on the project. And then the DEIR, the draft environmental impact report that they produced for this project was enormously flawed, and this was a huge focus of our research and of our messaging on this. I would say the most outrageous bit of this was the fact that for all of their analysis, all of the traffic, air quality, flight impact, greenhouse gas emissions, all the impacts of this project, in their environmental impact report, LAWA only looked to 2028. 2028 is the build out year of the project. So this project, which would not have had any time to actually increase the capacity of the airport via the addition of 2 new gates or 21 new gates and 2 new terminals, none of that growth would be achieved yet. So the impact wouldn't be very high. You have to look into the future to see what impact that will have. Except that in their EIR, they cut off all their analysis at the year the project is to be built out, and then said, hey, look at how little impact this will have, which is kind of staggering to us, but apparently is what you can get away with. But it had other major flaws in the EIR too. There was a lot of inadequate analysis of the traffic impact. They understated the noise impacts in a number of ways. And they kind of drastically underestimated the air quality, health risk, and greenhouse gas impacts of the project. And then there were mitigation failures as well. So we had member actions at pretty much every level of that we could, where there were kind of public participation in the CEQA draft approvals. One of them was one of the biggest ones that we did was when Los Angeles World of Airports, the group that runs LAX, their Board of Airport Commissioners, which would be the equivalent of the Port Authority here in Oakland for this project. When they certified the final EIR, we had a very, very substantial action for that. And then after it was certified, which of course it was, because the airlines tend to move the airport to do what they want, and then the Board of Airport Commissioners kind of just does whatever the airport wants. We ended up having to file a formal appeal, which one of the functions of a formal appeal of a certification of final EIR is it until it's resolved, they cannot move forward on the project, and then you still have the ability to sue. Otherwise, the clock is ticking. You have like a 30-day window before you can sue to stop the project. If not, you can no longer do so. So when the appeal was denied by the city council, because that's who hears it, and this is how you get it in front of the electeds, is through the appeal of the certification of the final EIR. That was denied by the city council, but under the sort of understanding, and this is part of our political efforts on this, which I'll also talk about, part of the understanding was that the airport was going to bargain with us on what this looks like, what a adequate settlement agreement would look like on this this kind of campaign. And so we ended up having to get what was called a tolling agreement, which preserved our right to sue with them beyond what would be the normal window while we were bargaining with the airport, which was a 4-month process and a very unfun experience that I would not recommend. So the political aspects of this campaign.
Sorry to interrupt, Casey.
Yeah.
We're running short on time, and I want to make sure there's enough chance for
Sure.
Q&A. How many more slides do you have?
5 or 6. I can try to run through them pretty quickly.
Yeah, maybe keep it to remarks that might be applicable to Oakland, and people can contact you, Q&A, and contact you later for more details.
Sure.
Sorry to hurry you.
So the politics, city electeds were, I think, by far the most instrumental. The mayor who's typically a big ally of ours, was kind of in the process of getting appointed to be ambassador to India. So suddenly we had a kind of empty mayor's office, which was a substantial complication to this campaign. And so we ended up having to deal with, our biggest ally was the city council member who represented the district that covers LAX, which is Mike Bonin, not a pre-existing ally of ours. But when it came to pushing the airport and getting political pressure on this entire process, everyone was deferential to Bonin, given that he's the council member whose district it was. So he was really instrumental in this whole process. He introduced resolutions calling for a community benefits agreement to be part of the conditions of approval for this project. He made resolutions related to the transit demands for this project, and then he's the one that's pushing the funding for the studies. Maxine Waters, the congresswoman in that area, did push them a little bit, but not in ways that were terribly useful or helpful. So I'll kind of skim past her. The Bureau of Contract Administration, which I mentioned before, was part of the sort of labor fixes. Is an organization we work with a lot, and it was really those relations are really helpful in landing that piece of this. The coalition, this is one thing Oakland has going for it right now, is I think you guys have a great coalition here. We were not able to get as many groups as we wanted that could commit to any sort of capacity to address this campaign. But the handful that were within the coalition that were able to at least throw some people or some staff time at this were enormously helpful. Sunrise Movement in Los Angeles was really, really essential in communications and at our actions. And we got a lot of technical expertise during the bargaining process on the solutions from Coalition for Biological Diversity, their scientists, and the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Several of these groups signed on to our CEQA appeal. The CEQA appeal is strengthened by having a coalition on it and not just be driven by a labor organization. But yeah, limited capacity was the name of the game in the coalition efforts. It does not help that a lot of this came at a critical time during the first year of COVID. So orgs were really stretched thin. And then we were also kind of partnered up with another major union at LAX, Unite Here Local 11, Coalition for Clean Air, gave us a lot of advice on dealing with the community benefits aspect of this. They ran, or they sort of oversaw the last community benefits agreement related to LAX. And then scientists from USC and other universities helped out quite a bit, as well as RSAC, which is a group that sort of consistently fights airport expansion at LAX, but more of a, to be quite honest, more of a NIMBY group representing the wealthy communities north of the airport. So a bit of a weird ally, but they have a lot of experience in this area. Messaging, we really centered our campaign on environmental justice, environmental equity issues, environmental racism. This is a huge factor for LAX, given that under the flight path to the east of the airport are all majority Black and brown communities that bear the brunt of the growth of the airport and its activity. So we did a lot of things like trainings our own members on environmental justice, environmental racism issues. As you can imagine, it can be difficult to get folks who are concerned about their jobs and do they get enough hours for the week and their wages to start thinking about environmental justice issues when they have so many more things. But we were able to move a lot of our folks, and we had a lot of great messengers for these issues. You know, they're real people that work at the airport or live near it. Yeah, community impact and health impacts were a huge part of our messaging. Talk a lot about airport adjacent communities, talk a lot about how large LAX's role is in local air quality, try to quantify the project's impact in terms of air quality, health, noise, traffic. We even did a community canvas to kind of inform people about the expansion and help agitate on it. And then we targeted the industry itself a lot in our messaging. It is a heavily subsidized industry. It is one that was bailed out in the early days of COVID, several $billions to pretty much each major airline. And it's a polluting industry that is growing, and its polluting footprint is only going to be growing and only estimated to be growing in the future. And then we also try to show the sort of nexus between the expansion of this industry and declining standards for service workers like our members. Common threads here. I think this last slide. I think there's a similar but not identical environmental justice story to be told at the Oakland Airport. You're still dealing with airport adjacent communities. It's not quite as extreme as it is in LAX, where you have, you know, so many more people that live right next to the airport, so many more people that are directly under the flight paths than you do, but you still have some of those same stories, I think, to be told related to an Oakland expansion with the way it affects parts of East Oakland and Alameda. You're still dealing with the same industry. In this case, Southwest Airlines has like 80% market share at Oakland Airport. So this project is happening because they are cool with it and they want it. There's a lot of compelling stories to be told about the industry and its climate impact and what it isn't doing right in the future for that. And then it's a coalition campaign. It's one that's going to be strengthened by a large variety of groups working together on this. I think you guys have a really great head start on that. And then there's similar potential political leverage, likely focused on, I would say the local politics of it would be the most fruitful, but you should leave no stone unturned in this area. Hopefully the political realities are not nearly as challenging on this project that they were for us in LAX. And then this is a similar project with the same environmental review and legal process, CEQA, NEPA, you're still going to have public comment periods. You're still going to have certification of the EIR. You're still going to have a document to react to dissect and critique. And one that I expect will generate a lot of outrageous nonsense about what this project is actually going to do. So yeah, I guess I'll leave the questions for the end. Sorry that this went a little long, but it's airport expansions are enormously complex efforts. So, and this was a real challenge for us to lead as a labor organization. Not the best fit running environmental justice, but we kind of had to work with what we had. So a lot of stuff we had to learn on the fly to make this happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Casey. I'm really glad that you got in the last 2 slides that answered the questions I was going to ask you about the environmental justice impacts, community impacts, and how these 2 campaigns are, sister campaigns. I want to open up the chat to questions to both Dan and Casey. We only have 15 minutes till the end of the meeting, but depending who else wants to stay on, we could continue to have an informal discussion. So please just type in your question to share with everybody, but I will read them out to try and focus the discussion. And while you take a minute to think about your questions and type them up, I'm going to start off with a question to Dan. The 11% aviation emissions that you said accounted for the Bay Area aviation emissions, I wanted to understand if those include the non-CO2 warming impacts as well.
It's a good question. They do not. And it's actually one of the backup slides I have is touching upon this question about the climate impact of nitrogen oxides, water vapor, contrail cirrus, et cetera. Those are, well, there's uncertainty around those, but by the best scientific estimate, non-CO2 climate impact of aviation is on the order of twice as large as CO2 alone. So you add them all together, the greenhouse gas footprint or climate footprint of aviation could be as large as 3 times as what I've presented. But there is uncertainty around that and complications around the timescales of the pollutants and the elevation of the pollutants. But yes, the problem is likely bigger than what I've presented today.
That's really interesting and scary because 11% is already a big number. So to think that that could potentially actually be doubled for the warming impacts, comparing that to our other emission sources in the Bay Area, this is a big piece. Does that 11% include cargo, or is that just passenger aviation?
It is passenger only. Cargo it's about a 20% add-on overall. We've got some data gaps that have kept us from putting out a cargo figure. Unfortunately, FedEx and UPS don't globally report their operations, and as accordingly, we haven't integrated them fully into our inventory yet, but you can guess it's probably 20% larger if you add freight on top.
And I want to note that both there is cargo coming out of the Oakland Airport, so I need to research what percentage of flights are cargo flights, but they are significant.
These are 2 things that we are hoping to update the airport tracker for this year, is freight emissions, and not non-CO2, but air pollution. Casey made a really excellent point about fine particulate matter. That is a major emerging issue. So we would hope to have NOx estimates, nitrogen oxide estimates, and also non-volatile particulate matter estimates integrated into the airport tracker by the end of the year.
Oh, Ariella, you just went muted. There you go.
Oh.
There you go. Okay.
Thank you, Dan, for that answer. I'm going to look at the chat list and read out some questions. From Michael, he asks, how did the SEIU USWW come to lead in Los Angeles? And what about Oakland?
So LA, I mean, we spent the better part of a year trying to gather the coalition. Our original envisioning of it was this would be a community benefits agreement type effort, and we would anchor the labor elements of it and the labor impact elements of it, and that the environmental groups who were far more qualified to lead on that part of it would lead that piece of it. And then we also originally kind of had housing groups in the coalition that was going to be part of it too, and just limited capacity from the environmental groups that we were able to get on this. They just weren't able to substantially drive that piece of it. So we ended up having to consult with as many folks as we can to learn what we could to do so. And ended up taking more of a driver's seat role on those pieces of it, more than we would have liked, but there was no alternative for the most part. So that's why we're fairly pleased with the outcomes, given what an awkward fit it was for labor to be leading those kinds of pieces. For Oakland, we have a far smaller member footprint at Oakland Airport. So we're likely going to be, part of the coalition, and then hopefully, my experience on the LAX campaign can be useful throughout this fight too.
Thanks, Casey. It's hard for me to wade through the questions in the chat. Jackie asked, is there concern from medical community on health impacts, long-term studies of health impacts to frontline communities and workers? Casey, I think you have some references to that in the report you wrote, Turbulence Ahead, for the LA context. Yes.
I wrote pretty lengthy white paper laying out the impact of LAX on its adjacent communities. I mean, these are within, just like adjacent to LAX are some of the highest asthma rate communities in the entire country, and in LA County under the flight path. But the science on this was not, certainly when we started, was not overwhelming. That ties it directly to airline activity. It's a challenging space. Some of the few folks that did do some of the work on it are folks that we have been in touch with and we've been working with, and we're trying to get them to help shape the community health study that is going to be funded by the Los Angeles City Council that came out of this campaign. But I mean, there's one of them is like, forget the exact stat, but like preterm births, dependent on your proximity to an airport, are just like tremendously more likely. Ultrafine particulate matter from LAX's operations extends like 10 miles east of the airport. So we want to really get down to the bottom of what the health impacts of that kind of stuff are. We suspect, and a lot of the academics, without getting ahead of themselves, strongly suspect that this kind of study would reveal a whole host of health issues. And then we get to the fun question of like what exactly to do about it. But that said, the first part is we're generating the study to deal with how it affects the communities and how it affects frontline workers at the airport.
Thanks. Rochelle asks, please speak to the potential impact of using soy-based airline fuels. This will be used as a huge selling point since it will lower some degree of pollutants. Communities nearby will want lower emissions and jobs. This is a big sell. And Dan, you can jump in, but also I believe that Gary Hughes from Biofuel watches on the call. So Gary, also please speak up.
I mean, I'd fully defer to Dan right here. The webinar's been really informative.
Sure, I can speak to this a little bit. My big caveat is that I'm an airframe and engines guy. I'm not a fuels guy. And we have an entire separate team of researchers that works on these fuels issues. So, I mean, there are a couple of issues here. We have the greenhouse gas impacts of using sustainable aviation fuels on one hand. We have the air pollution benefits of using those fuels is kind of a second thread. And then the third is the economics of it. Greenhouse gas impacts I touched on earlier. There's a lot of uncertainty around this issue just because of the question of indirect land use change and how much does using like a soy feedstock or a corn feedstock drive increased agricultural production in the tropics and therefore deforestation. So controversial, a lot of differing opinions. By our estimates, crop-based sustainable aviation fuels will be roughly as greenhouse gas intensive as fossil jet fuels. So in essence, no benefit, shouldn't be prioritized. Any sustainable aviation fuel you produce, whether you produce it from crops or wastes or renewable electricity, it will have low sulfur. And as a result, it will reduce your ultrafine particulate matter, that pollutants that Casey just mentioned. And that will have health benefits. So that's weighing on the other side, that these sustainable aviation fuels will be low sulfur and therefore they'll reduce local air pollution. The third thread is economics. The economics around SAFs are terrible. They remain 2 to 5 times as expensive as fossil jet fuel. Airlines talk a big game, but they are fundamentally not at all interested in paying more than for fuels. So left to their own devices and existing policies, I expect no uptake of sustainable aviation fuels by airlines whatsoever. You do want to be on the lookout for big drivers. So either large incentives or mandates that could drive their use. That you'd want to be on the lookout for. But personally, I've been working on this for almost 15 years now. There's been virtually no progress made at all on uptake of SAFs. And unless there are large incentives or mandates to drive it, I actually don't expect that to change.
Yeah, that's just really quickly then, Ariella, because you called on me. That's super informative. This webinar has been incredible. I did put one link in there that's a blog post from Biofuel Watch that includes the links to the comment letters that were submitted on the draft EIR process of the refinery conversions here in the Bay, and all-star cast signing on to those letters. And I really hope everyone just keeps that stuff handy as a reference for this work.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dan. I'd like to turn this over to Jean. Jean Tepperman has a letter that was written by Communities for Better Environment that was submitted to the Port of Oakland as part of the notice of preparation when our campaign was coming together, making suggestions, observations to include as part of the scoping for the draft EIR. Jean's going to read some of this letter because it addresses the environmental justice impacts particular to the local airport community.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm not going to read a lot of it, but I just want to summarize the main points that it makes. One thing the letter points out is that the Oakland Airport, the community around the Oakland Airport is already rated super high in the 90th percentile on the California Environmental Screening tool, which means that it's rated for both environmental and socio-demographic burdens. And so the airport is already a significant source of some of the environmental impacts and burdens that people are experiencing. They're also saying that the increased flights would lead to an increase in particulate matter and toxic air contamination directly from the air flights themselves. But in addition to that, emissions from all the other aspects of the increased operation, including ground transportation and fugitive emissions from refueling. Also, from the vehicle traffic, the expansion of the cargo facilities means more trucks coming in and out. And so there's going to be a lot more greenhouse gas and particulate matter and toxic chemical pollution, not only from the airplanes themselves, but from all the other increased activity that increased air flights will bring. They also mentioned the project would involve some demolition, and they are saying that you have to include the impact of all of the air quality problems caused by the demolition, including what happens when they go to the recycling centers, which East Oakland already has a lot of, which already cause huge air pollution impacts in East Oakland. The greenhouse gas emissions, they're saying, of course, again, not just from the airplanes, but from all of the supporting activities, and also a potential leak of methane from the expanded tank farms that they're planning to put in to serve the expanded flights. And there are a lot of fugitive emissions from the fuel tank farm are also part of what's going to be happening. And the hazardous materials involved in the fuel tanks themselves, they note that the East Bay's just recently experienced the New Star explosion of fuel tanks in Rodeo. And no, it wasn't an explosion, it was a fire. And it creates increased risks of fire and also increased risks of explosion, also noise pollution. So those are just some of the specific impacts that the airport expansion would have on the East Oakland community, which is already seriously impacted. That's all.
So, Ariella, so we do need to start wrapping the program up. So we'll stay close to 2:30. But I do want to say again, a few things. So can you put in again into the chat how people can get involved in the Stop Oakland expansion, and any other actions or talks that that's coming up on this project? Oh, you're unmuted. You're muted.
I encourage people to go to the website www.stopoakexpansion.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, which will provide action updates. We meet monthly. The next meeting is March 30th. It's a Wednesday, a 7 p.m. meeting. So sign up for the newsletter updates and you'll get the Zoom link to that. We're just continuing to network and spread awareness and build capacity for the public response period in the fall of this year.
Okay, thanks. And then let's see, I'm looking at all these things in the chat. It's very interesting. Jean, and you want to take a second to mention the petition from Sunflower Alliance on no drilling. Okay, well, you're on mute, Jean.
Thank you so much. I'll just say really quickly, there's a big campaign in Contra Costa County to get the county to outlaw oil and gas drilling in the county, because now there's actually a push to increase oil and gas drilling in Eastern Contra Costa right now. There's already one site operating and others have been applied for. And so we have a petition to ban oil and gas drilling in the Contra Costa General Plan, which is now under revision. And I hope you will all, I think there's going to be a link to that. Yes, there's a link to that petition in the chat. And if you're a Contra Costa resident, please sign it. If you're not a Contra Costa resident, send it to everybody you know. And even if you are a Contra Costa resident, send it to everybody you know, because we really need to get a lot of signatures on this petition. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank Ariella for organizing this, and Dan and Casey, you guys were so informative. I mean, I think we all have a lot more questions, but I want to respect people's time, and it is a beautiful day out. But for follow-up, is it okay if people perhaps contact you with questions, or they can contact Ariella and it can go through? Because I think there's going to be a lot more conversation generated from this. I see a thumbs up from Casey there, and Dan, thank you. And you can drop things into the chat. That was really a great webinar. And you might know that we have been talking a lot about biofuels here in our county because of the conversions of Phillips 66 and Marathon. And I really appreciated, Dan, that you called out the fact that it's really not a net savings of greenhouse gas emissions, that it is not a win for really the frontline community or for the environment. And that's something we're looking at a lot going forward. We're still in the trenches as we wait for comments back from, or a response from comments that we all signed for the draft EIR on this project. So I just want to let people on this call know that there is ongoing work on this, and you're welcome to get in touch. We're happy to talk to you more about that through 350 Contra Costa, Sunflower Alliance, or Biofuels Watch, Gary Hughes' organization there. So there are quite a few environmental organizations in coalition keeping a very sharp eye on this development to see what we can do. And let's see, there's Casey and Dan have put their emails in the chats if people want to grab that, and Ariella's in there too. So I know we didn't get quite as much time as we wanted for this discussion, but think of it as a beginning, and the conversation will continue. There's a lot more to talk about EJ-wise, as Jean started touching upon, in the communities there in Oakland that would be really impacted by the expansion. And I think the awareness of this project is just kind of growing. You know, people are very slow to take alarm, and sometimes they need a lot of education repeatedly before they come out to meetings and want to know what they can do. So that is the beginning of this process. Well, the beginning for us, not for Stay Grounded, Stop Oakland expansion. But please spread the word with the education you've gotten here today. And you know, it's also the beginning of, we're going to be into the summer travel season before you know it. And this kind of conversation about the ethics and the impacts of air flight will come up in your daily life. And it's a tough conversation to have with people who love to travel. And but the fact is that we have a disproportionate impact on people who will be the victims of climate change and who may never have been in an airplane in their life. So our actions are not harmless, to be realistic. They might be common and culturally acceptable, but they are not harmless. And when we go to biofuels, we'll be talking about how many acres of soybeans does it take us to go to Hawaii for vacation? That will be an interesting conversation. But I just want to thank everybody for coming out today. And one event that we have coming up is the Green Sofa Cinema. That comes out, that's a once a month on a Wednesday night. And Lisa has dropped that into the chat. Thank you, Lisa. Our behind the scenes Zooms are. And the topic is fast fashion and the wastefulness of how we dress ourselves. So please feel free to sign up for that. And there's some movies to watch. And thank you all very much. We hope some of you will come back and look at our websites for Sunflower. There's a lot coming up in the future. And for 350 Contra Costa, we will be having some Earth Day events later in April, and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Enjoy the Super Bowl.